Nick Allen, welcome to the Pulling Focus podcast.
Pulling Focus. Appreciate you, Riley.
Yeah, really excited to have you here. And to start, I would love a quick intro on you and your role, and talk a little bit about United Way of the Greater Triangle and what you all do, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, so I'm Nick Allen. My official title is Chief Program Officer of the United Way of the Greater Triangle, which means I have the distinct, honorable pleasure of supporting our community impact team. And so that includes the way that we invest resources across our 4-county footprint. And it includes our marketing and storytelling work, the way that we tell stories about what we invest in and the impacts that we have. It includes our volunteer and community engagement, the way that we facilitate experiences for people to get close to our nonprofit partners and the people that they serve. And a new piece of work that we call Neighborhood Impact, which I think is our big bet on changing the center of gravity in philanthropy around who gets to decide what the issues are, who gets to decide what assets communities have, and then who gets to decide the solutions and the path forward. And oftentimes in philanthropy, those decisions are made by us and these ivory towers of funders. But I think the people experiencing the pain, experiencing the issue, should play a leading role in deciding that. And so that team is about 6 people deep. And if you know anything about the United Way, we raise money and then we invest that money. And the community impact team is focused on investing the money, the talent, the time, the resources of the triangle in general towards our mission to eradicate poverty and increase social mobility through the power of partnerships.
So tell me a little bit more about that previous point about that new team you've put together. And you mentioned how it shifted a little bit of who is deciding of like the problems to be fixed and the cultural shifts that need to happen. Like, when was that team put together and what sort of sparked that?
Yeah, so probably about 6 years ago, there was a CEO change at the United Way. And I would venture to say that, United Ways across the country are fighting for relevancy, fighting to evolve into something that their particular communities need. And we certainly, in the midst of that leadership change, saw the opportunity to kind of, I like to call it a control burn down to the studs of the organization, and then build back new with a focus, with an intentionality, and evolution to that relevancy in mind. And so over the past 6 years or so, we've not only, changed the way that we've invested, we needed people that were oriented in the ways that, in the organizational values, and oriented to the world with a perspective that agreed with the idea that our work should be inclusive and should be about convening people and not exclusive. And I think there's a brand that United Way has, there's a brand that philanthropy has that we're fighting up against, certainly in that change. But we've got some incredible people at the United Way that have helped us get to the point where we are now. And I think we've been pretty successful in evolving to something that the Triangle really looks to and to lead conversations, to convene groups of people, and to invest in the right kind of work.
So that evolution you're talking about, and that controlled burn, what were some of the hardest parts of that? Like challenges that maybe you consistently faced and you still are facing, or is there like one moment that you point to of like, that was really difficult for us to get past?
Certainly. I mean, we talk a lot about changing systems, right? Whether it be the systems that, hold poverty together, or even the system of philanthropy, right? And if you know anything about kind of the way that systems are built, they're designed to produce the things that we see in the world, right? And they're very resistant to change. And those things could be bad and they could be good, right? And so when you're thinking about changing the system of philanthropy, there's a lot of pushback, right? The United Way is 135 years old, right? So there's expectations that exist in the community where people are like, hey, that's not what the United Way is supposed to do, right? And so I think all along the way, people have questioned the evolution and moves and decisions that have been made. They've resisted it. They've opted out, right? Like, that's not what I want to be a part of, and that's okay, right?
Yeah.
But I think part of that, I think what makes our movement and our evolution so strong is that we're pretty rooted in kind of the beliefs and the values associated with the work. And when you have that kind of conviction, while you may start to, lose former supporters,
Sure.
I think you have the opportunity to gain new ones. And so we've certainly made new partnerships and broadened the network in that way. And the issues that we talk about, right? Like, you cannot be anti-poverty without being anti-racist, right? That is not a political statement, even though it has been politicized so much in the conversations that are happening in the world today. I think without fully understanding what that means or how we operationalize that, people make decisions based off of that statement itself, right? And so I think the real opportunities are when people lean in and ask questions, and we have the opportunity to learn together, learn from each other, and then people fully understand the work that we're trying to do, and then that's when success happens, right? But I think the biggest barrier is when people, off the surface of statements like that, or see our website, or see our values, and then make decisions without leaning in and asking for more, I think is one of the biggest barriers that we run up against.
Yeah, and I want to circle back to that. I want to ask something more general about United Way, and then kind of go back to some of those like narratives. So what differentiates United Way from like a chapter to chapter basis? Like, how many chapters are there in the country, or like generally how many, and what would make each one different, or are they pretty similar?
Yeah. So there's over 1,000 local markets, right? And each local United Way has the responsibility to respond to the specific needs in their community. There is an umbrella United Way worldwide organization that we kind of sit underneath, but there's a whole lot of local autonomy around the way you go about doing your work. And there's influence up and down that chain in terms of priorities or suggested priorities or resources to support specific types of work. But here in the Triangle, we listen to our community. We listen to the people that we serve, being the nonprofits or the people that they serve. We listen to our donors and our support network to really guide the way that we show up. It's not just, a group of 23 people making decisions. It's a real community effort. And that value shows up a lot, right? Like, not only in the way that we talk about solution and co-creation, but also in the way that we talk about strategic planning, in the way that we make funding decisions, right? Like, there's a community aspect to almost every single part of our work. And it's really important that we're consistent in that way, because when we're not, I think people lose trust or belief in the organization.
Yeah, and listening is something that I think every single guest so far has talked about in different contexts. And I'm imagining it is incredibly important to listen to the needs of the communities, just from like an open lens, and listening to different opinions, and just getting like just a spectrum of what the community is telling you. One of the things I asked a previous guest, Beth Ann, was what advice would you give to somebody on how to listen well? And I'm curious to get your response. Like, what have you seen in your time with United Way of this has been a great example of how I've listened and how and what's happened because of that? Or just like in general, what is your advice towards how to listen to someone?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is, listen with the intent to learn and not listen with the intent to respond. I think that, and I've done engagement work in local municipalities, right, where listening is like a token activity, right? You listen to say we listened, but didn't necessarily have the intention of really learning from the opportunity, the conversation, and then applying that learning. I think listening, the evidence of listening is important, right? So there are communities all across the triangle that have been poked and prodded and quote unquote listened to, but they don't see any results of the information that they share, the experiences that they share, right? And so kind of the feedback loop of listening and then applying and changing things according to that information, that new piece of information, that new piece of data that you may have, I think is the often forgotten about part of the listening.
That's really good. And I said I would circle back, and it connects to this in some way of, you just mentioned there are so many statements that are put out, and people make decisions from reading a headline, or there's something that they've believed for a long period of time, and it really shapes their perspective. What role does storytelling play for your chapter of the United Way in helping change mindsets and educate people and getting people in the room to be able to listen from a perspective of learning? What role does storytelling play?
It's an incredible important piece, right? And so, again, circling back to this idea of systems change, right? There's a model that kind of outlines the most critical pieces to address when you're thinking about changing a system, right? It's policy, practice, culture, behaviors. And at the top of that systems change model is mental models, right? The way that people view the world around them. And one of the, I do presentations around systems change, and one of the activities is this idea of sharks, right? Think about, we've been socialized to fear sharks, right? Movies, music, Shark Week, right? Like there's a literal sound, there's a literal song that I'm sure pops in most people's heads when they think about or talk about sharks, right? The Jaws theme, right? And so whether it be through media, through movies, through music, through images, this fear, this mental model that we should fear sharks exists in a lot of people. But there are a ton of things that we engage with every single day that are more dangerous than sharks, that kill more people a year than sharks do, right? Cows, vending machines, corks, right? Like none of those things have mental models that say they are dangerous.
There's no cork song.
But factually, from a data-driven standpoint, those things are more dangerous than sharks, right? And so storytelling is an opportunity to rearrange the mental models that people have around poverty, people living in poverty, that have been kind of formed over somebody's lifetime, right? Stories built the mental model that exists currently, and in my estimation, stories can change that mental model into something that is more relevant and true. And so I think traditionally in the United Way setting, stories have been used to raise money, right? And I think we certainly rely on stories to compel people to give, but we also have to think about the powers that story has to impact the world well beyond that dollar that you give, right? That dollar that you give has a short shelf life. But if we can permanently change the way that people see the world around them, interact and engage with the communities around them, then I think we're getting to sustainable solutions, right? That dollars just can't achieve.
Yeah, I love that. Like the long-lasting change that's brought about, as opposed to maybe sometimes the easier solution of putting money towards something. Are there any stories that come to mind that you've been able to experience or been a part of or have just heard or seen firsthand in your work that really stick out of, wow, this was really impactful, or this maybe changed my mental model towards something, or any other effect? Like, do any stories kind of stick out?
I live in Durham. I live in East Durham specifically. And the story of Hayti is a significant one. Hayti was one of the black Wall Streets in this country, right? Where black wealth was on display. Business owners, academia, right? It was, I think, a community that was very successful in kind of building a self-sustaining ecosystem, right? In a time when it was pretty difficult in this country to be successful if you were black. And then, as history would have it, 147 is built, right? And the systemic destruction of that community resulted in, I think, displacement. It resulted in kind of a slow decline in ownership of both land and business in that community. And to hear people, and so fast forward to 2023, right? And we get to work alongside people in that community who have lived their entire life and have like witnessed the change, right? And to see them, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, still fighting for a return back to a thriving Hayti community is incredible, right? Just to like sit and listen to elders who have every reason to give up, who have every reason to not believe in a brighter future for their community. They have every reason to be angry, right? You just don't, but they're not. They're not giving up. They have a clear vision for the future, and it's done with such grace, right? Like that type of experience, I think, has been pretty impactful for me, especially in a world where fighting seems to be the norm.
Yeah.
Now, don't get it twisted. Like, there's some tense moments that occur, right?
Yeah.
But it's not about fighting against something. It's about fighting for something. And I think that kind of energy is a lesson that we could learn, and a lot of people can learn from.
That's really powerful. And I'm just wondering, like, with this fighting for something, like what has that experience specifically taught you? And have just sitting there listening, hearing this, seeing the way these people navigate, pushing for this vision they have with grace, like how has that impacted you in the work that you do every day?
Focus. I think fighting against something is a distraction, and we see lots of distractions in the world. And it's usually under the guise of we got to fight against this to achieve that, right? But you lose focus of that what you're fighting for, and so I think if you keep that focus, then barriers don't become endpoints. They just become things to work around, right? And I think oftentimes when we run up against a barrier, it becomes the focus of what we do.
Sure.
Right? And it becomes so important to beat that barrier. Sometimes you need to tear the wall down, but sometimes you can walk around it. You can get over it. You can get under it, right? Like, and so you only leave those options on the table when your focus and your purpose is beyond the most immediate barrier that you have.
What advice would you give to somebody who's trying to understand a barrier versus like the big picture? Like they're running up against a constant thing and they're trying to make systems change.
Right.
how do they know if they're going to need to tear that barrier down or go around it?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think really being clear and intentional about defining your purpose is important. Because it's hard to do that in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of a fight, in the midst of a tense moment. That purpose has to be so ingrained in you that you can recall it regardless of what's swirling around your head, right? And I fully believe in, community being a part of that, right? Express your purpose, right? Build in, accountability from your community. Say, hey, you're losing focus. Remember what your purpose is, right? And that kind of support, that kind of network, that kind of community, I think is critically important to, advancing around, through, over, under barriers, right? And, whatever tactics you need to stay on course, I think it's dependent on what the barrier is and what tools you have on your tool belt that day.
Sure.
But if the intent and the purpose is clear, and you're reminded of it either individually or by your community, you'll figure out a way to keep it moving.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned when we grabbed lunch a couple weeks back was our area, and the area you serve is very diverse and very different depending on where you are. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and I'd love to hear about just your experience listening to these different areas and different people within the place that you all serve, and just how you approach that.
Yeah. So the 4 counties that we serve are Orange, Durham, Wake, and Johnston counties. Orange, being a Tar Heel, and my introduction to North Carolina was Chapel Hill. That's a very interesting place, right? A college town that has the tendency to sweep their issues under the rug, under the bed, hide them a little bit. But it doesn't take long to realize that there's some real disparity happening in Orange County. The next place I lived after Orange County was Durham, and did some work and had the opportunity to work in some of the lowest resourced communities in Durham, right? And remember the story I told you about Hayti and how 147 decimated that community. Well, the first community I worked in Durham is a place called Hickstown, and they're known for diverting 147. They refused to have 147 divide their community. And so, Durham has this rich history of fighting for what it believes in, a rich history in strong Black communities. And so, that's unique in that those 4 counties that I mentioned. Wake County holds the capital of the state, right? Raleigh. And with that comes, I think, lots of opportunity, lots of resources, but also pretty significant barriers, right? And so after I worked in Durham, I worked at the Boys and Girls Club in Southeast Raleigh, ran the boys club. And it was so interesting that, and these were very similar to the kids that I worked with in Durham, right? From low-resourced communities. And they had a perception that Durham was the worst place on earth and that they were like better than in some aspects, right? And I had to remind them, I was like, look, Southeast Raleigh looked just like East Durham to me. And I think that perspective and that the proximity and the lack of understanding the connectivity and the thread that holds us all together was something that was pretty apparent in my time in Raleigh. And then Johnston County is a rural part of the Triangle. Has some, I think, they're at an earlier point on their journey to really having open conversations about race and equity. But it happens to be, I think, the fastest growing county in the state. And so very quickly, they're going to experience those growing pains.
Yeah.
It may serve that community well to really start to build the infrastructure, to have the conversations to deal with some of the things that happen when you grow and resources come and more diversity comes to a geography.
How do you engage with community leaders in each of these 4 counties?
I think you have to start. I'm a relationship builder, and so it can't be a transactional conversation, right? And again, reminded that United Way is a 135-year-old brand. There are expectations that people have, right or wrong, about what we do and how we show up and who we are, and oftentimes we spend a lot of time kind of like extracting those expectations, right? Building trust, redefining for people what the United Way is, listening to what their needs are, being very, very clear and transparent about what we see as our role, not overpromising anything to anybody, right? United Way walks in the room and people think we got checkbooks in our pocket and we can just write you a check to support whatever you got going on. That's not the way it works, right? And so just human connection, talking to people like real people, setting expectations early, and just being authentic is a way that I've gone around, my whole career engaging all types of folks, right? From elected officials to, people living in impoverished environments. And so I don't change who I am depending on the audience. Because you never know who's going to see you switch up, right? And the easiest thing I know how to do is to be me. And I think I certainly encourage my team to be authentic in the same ways. It's not about making people like you, right? It's just about reaffirming people's belief in humanity, right? And that's I think core to effective engagement.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about United Way as an organization?
That all we care about is money. That we are a overhead machine, right? Those things just aren't. And for good reason, right? Like there's a history of maybe not this United Way particular, but I think the brand in general that we're dinosaurs, right? Like that we're an old, archaic operation, and it doesn't take more than 5-10 minutes having a conversation with anybody on the team to realize that, oh, this is not your grandfather's United Way.
Yeah. Because of the age of the organization, there's that misconception.
The age, the brand, right? Like just like the lazy understanding. Like people recognize the logo, right? It show up on, NFL commercials and give, right?
Sure.
But that's not who we are, especially here in the Triangle. I think we have a clear understanding of what our role is. We have a clear understanding of what we believe in. And we want people that feel the same way to be a part of a movement to make the Triangle better, right? I have lots of conversations. I rarely ask people for money. right? Because it's not about money at the end of the day. It's about a community all pointing in the same direction, and striving for a goal to believe in the inevitable success of everybody.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities in the Triangle to point towards that success and for community and empowerment?
Mm-hmm.
Are there a couple areas that you're focused on right now?
Yeah, so I really think that the United Way is uniquely positioned because of the relationships that we hold.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have deep relationships with corporate partners and the people that work there. We have deep relationships with nonprofit partners. We're developing deeper relationships with local communities, local organizers, convened community groups. And so, part of our strategy moving forward is to convene rooms and groups of people, right? But I think a critical question of convene for what? Bring people in a room and then what do you do, right? You have to be very intentional about what you're convening around. But I think that answer for us is let's convene and co-create a path forward together, right? Where we design solutions that include the perspectives of everybody in that room. How do we together as human beings, take off your badge, take off your identification, take off the hat, your professional hat, right? But as human beings, how do we empathize with each other, understand that all of our experiences have equal value, and then how do we put all that experience into something that is a impactful way forward, and that people can rally around. And so that question of convene for what, design solutions, co-create solutions, I think is a real key opportunity that we have that we certainly intend to pursue.
And so that leads me to the question I ask everyone in terms of what's next in the story for the organization that you work for. What do you see as sort of like a future roadmap, or how you might see the organization changing or the community changing? What is in the near future and maybe the further along future for the story that United Way is a part of?
Yeah, I'm really excited now because we're at this flashpoint in the organization where, our equity work, our equitable investment processes, our anti-racist work, it was happening without kind of the structural components, right? It was happening because of the people that were in the organization at that particular point in time. And for that work to live on beyond anybody that's in the organization now, you need to kind of codify it in ways and build it into the structures and the systems of the organization. And I think we've done a really good job of that with our strategic planning process that we're just finishing up, right? We're headed towards a new mission, right? We're headed towards a refined set of values. We're headed towards an impact model that's going to focus on, investment, convening, and amplifying. And if I hit the lottery tomorrow, I'm out, right? But I'm out with the confidence that the work that we've been doing over the past 6 years will keep going.
Yeah.
And so I think that's significant. That is significant. That's how you resist kind of the reflex of systems to return back to normal for them, right? Is to build in these permanent structures. And so that's where we are, and that's where we're headed, and that's what's going to propel us to some pretty significant success in the future.
And so if anyone is interested in just being a part of this work and learning more figuring out like how they fit in to all of what we've talked about. What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so our website, unitedwaytriangle.org, has ways that you can learn about the work that we're doing, the investments we make, what we care about. Has opportunities about how to get engaged in volunteer and engagement activities. Or if you just want to talk to somebody, the staff page has contact information. Find anybody that you feel comfortable reaching out to on that staff page, and set up a conversation, and they'll be happy to kind of bring you into the fold and figure out the best ways to keep people connected.
Awesome. Well, Nick, thank you so much for your time. I've loved this conversation. Great to get to know you a little bit better and learn a little bit more about the organization. And again, if anyone has any questions, visit the website, reach out. But yeah, thank you. Any last words or anything else you'd want to say?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity. It's great to just have organic conversation. And tap into passions, right? Like, this is not just work, right? Like, this is a way of life, and always happy to talk about that. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yep.